Hello, students. Welcome to the first lecture on 20th century English poetry. Today we're going to see or talk about poetry and its literary periods. So it's kind of quick guide to general understanding. Let's go ahead and discover what you have to say. Okay, so today's talking point is about what is poetry and historical and literary periods. We'll be discussing these two items today. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to learn what poetry is all about and its literary historical period. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So the first question is, what is poetry? So I've written a kind of long sort of paragraph to make you understand. Of course, I believe that you all know by this time what poetry is all about because you have covered quite a good number of poetry course, so you have far more better understanding. But for the sake of this course, 20th century English poetry, I would like to give you a kind of small brush up to refine your understanding of poetry. So let's go and then see what they have to say about poetry. Okay, poetry is a mode of writing that is as focused on rhythm, meter, and sound as on meaning and communication. It especially emphasizes the interaction of sound and sense. So two things we need to understand. One is poetry is all about rhythm, meter, sound, and of course, by combining all these things, you need to give meaning and communication as well. So poetry is a medium of communication, and of course, with meaning. And mostly, poetry deals with sound and five senses that we have. Okay, there are different definitions of poetry across different cultures around the world, and depending on historical periods, poetry, the definition of poetry evolves into something different. Every generation or period, they saw poetry different angle. But we're not gonna look into every single definition, but we'll just, for our purpose, try to find out a kind of understandable definition. Okay, so as you understand, it may cover song and chant. Chant is a kind of mantra, okay, and prayer and meditation, prose description and narrative, and even visual art. So these are all combined. They used to call them as poetry. Song is a form of poetry, they say. Okay. So its purposes range from religious ritual to popular entertainment. Whatever its focus, whatever its function, poetry is concerned with the auditory and visual way in which it hits its audience. Okay, so poetry is all about auditory. That means that we need to listen. Poetry is all about recitation. It's not to just quiet reading. You need to listen to poetry. Okay, you need to read out recitation. And of course, from recitation, we visually understand what is going on, what the poet like to say. We understand that. So as audience, we understand this. Okay, let's go ahead and see other kind of definition. So defining poetry, number one is that it's kind of expression of feelings and ideas. So a literary work in which the expression of feeling and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm. And collectively, poems, they are called poetry, and as a genre of literature, of course, a form of literature. It's taken from Oxford Languages. Okay. So what we understand here is that it's a kind of literary work, of course. And we use this literary form to express our feelings and ideas quite intensely. But for doing this, we use distinct style, okay, and rhythm. Style means the way we write. We compress our language to make meaning clear to our audience, to our reader. Okay, we try to use minimum language in poetry, but with powerful sensitivity to understand our, to make our feeling understandable to the audience. Next, let's see another one. So it's a kind of indirect representation. Poetry is about indirect representation. In poetry, words that are strung together to form sounds, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly. So poetry is a kind of medium, you can say. So we use sounds, images, and ideas put together to make some reader understand the complex and abstract ideas, what our feeling is all about. Okay, so we express our inner feeling through words, but words has to be sound sensitive, images and ideas together. Okay, but if you say directly, it should be very very complex, but poetry does that in a different angle. Let's see another one. Poetry gives us imaginative awareness. Okay, so poetry is all about imagination. Okay, poetry is a genre of literature that evokes a concentrated imaginative awareness of experience or a specific emotional response through language, chosen and arranged in its meaning, sound, and rhythm. So it's taken from Encyclopedia Britannica. So they say it's of course a form of literature that evokes, that give us a kind of concentrated, compressed imaginative awareness of experience and a specific emotional response through language. Again, language is key here, but language is chosen very carefully depending on the theme of the poetry and what we would like to say. And it's arranged for its meaning and sound and rhythm. So these 3 or 4 ideas go together in writing a poetry. Okay, let's see what we have to say here. So we just described the poetry in a different angle. Let's see let's see English poetry and its historical and literary periods. Okay, so we need to understand actually how far poetry has changed or evolved throughout the centuries, from Old English to modern or postmodern age now. So we'll have a brief characteristic guideline here. Let's see. You need to understand before we study modern poetry. We need to see a kind of lineage of Old English to postmodern or modern poetry. Let's see. So period, that means literary period or historical period. We can see Old English or later English, English period. It started in year 650. It's called the C. C means circa, as you can see down below. Circa is a Latin word meaning that approximately or around that year, that age, okay, that century. And it continued up to 1066, year 1066. So that period is called the Old English or later Old English period. And then we move downward to this 1066 to 1500, and it's called the Anglo-Norman or Middle English period. Probably you have gone through this kind of period in your history lesson or in your general poetry lesson, maybe in lectures. So I'm just giving you a kind of quick brush up to your understanding, just kind of refinement. Okay, then you move ahead to year 1500s to 1666, 1660. It's called the Renaissance period, and then we move downward to this period, 1660 to 1798. There's a neoclassicism or neoclassical period. Then we move to Romanticism, and it's started that period. And then Victorian period, 1832 to 1910. That's Victorian period. So every single period has got its own poetical characteristics we'll discover in a minute. We have other periods as well. So as you can see, there is a quite modern, this is such a pre-modern age. So 1890 to 1914, it's called the symbolism, age of symbolism. And from that symbolism, we find out modernism, okay? So I think I got it wrong here. So it should start from near about 1940, 14 to somewhere between 1945. So it's my mistake anyway. I'll make it correct later on. And then we move ahead to postmodernism. It's 1965, roughly to present age. Okay, that's the thing. Let's discover one by one. So let's see Old English period or later Old English period. So Old English poetry represent works in the oral tradition of bard that were committed to manuscript and preserved in monasteries. So as you understand, is 600 after Christ died, okay, 650. So at that period, English poetry was a kind of oral tradition. There was no written piece of poetry. People used to write poetry and they preserve through oral tradition, okay. They recite and memorize, and then they speak and then they recite in different occasions. This is the way of preservation of poetry at that period, okay. So but some of those were preserved in monasteries. You know, monasteries is a kind of religious establishment where monks live and pray and meditate to God. That's called the monasteries. And what is the interesting thing is the verses were probably memorized, of course, and may have been performed with musical accompaniment. So with music, different musical instrument, they used to chant or sing the poetry or recite the poetry. That was their tradition in the Old English or later Old English period. Many poems of this time were anonymous. People don't know who wrote that poem, so poets were kind of anonymous. They don't know. And poetry displayed a varying mixture of pagan and Christian elements. So in this poetry or poems, collection of poems, you'll find the pagan, that means non-religious, cultural ideas there, and of course Christian elements in those poetry. And then alliteration, of course, is one of the most used literary devices in those poems, because they used to stress on various syllables in those poems. Okay, so we understand. So number one thing is that it's the oral tradition of the bard. Oral tradition of bard means the poet, actually. Bard, it's kind of Old English. Bard is actually poet. Just kind of oral tradition to recite. And then it's, of course, memorized. And it was, those poems were recited through musical instrument. And poets were mostly anonymous. And the elements inside the poems, or the themes or ideas behind this were pagan and Christians elements. Let's go ahead and see what we have here. Now we move to Anglo-Norman or Middle English period. So as you understand from your history lesson, we call it the Norman Conquest. It happened in 1066 from Normandy, okay? The tribe of French people, they came onto English shore and they conquered England. So from that point, it's called the Norman Conquest. And after that, English poetry has a massive change. Okay, there was a lots of influence from French culture, French tradition of poetry writing and everything. So English poetry was influenced, of course, by the dominance of French culture, especially in the imitation of new French lyric form. So before that, English probably didn't have that much lyrical form from the French influence writing tradition. The new lyric form has been established into English literary tradition. Okay, and of course, syllabic meters based on classical Latin models just also introduced there. Rhyme appeared in English poetry, lyric rhyme. These are all musical kind of poems, um, um, very soothing to our ear. Those were introduced by the Frenchmen from Normandy, and of course a kind of genre of poetry is called the ballad is also emerged in that time. Let's go ahead. It's of course a brief idea behind this historical period. So we are not going to give a full details of everything. Probably don't need that at this time. So, but I'm going ahead with other thing to say. Now, this is interesting. Renaissance. Renaissance is very one of the most effective way of writing poems. It was a huge changes in every spheres of life in the Western European societies. Now, again, poetry is no other than uh, uh, thoughts of poetry hasn't changed that much, but the Renaissance has changed everything. Let's see. This revolt of humanistic culture focused on mankind. So one focuses on mankind rather than on God. That came from the West's reintroduction to Greek and Roman classics and marked a new interest in science and the arts. European poetry was greatly influenced by the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch, who pioneered the modern lyric based on a speaker meditating on his own feelings. Poets attempted to bring classical meters into English verse and to find English substitutes for them. The 14-line sonnet became popular during this period. The later Renaissance saw the rise of elements in poems of exaggeration, excess, and extravagant imagery. Now, as you can see, the first and foremost thing is that humanistic culture, which is mostly based on mankind. So mankind is fasting, or rather than God. So this is the Renaissance actually. And then, of course, that wave has committed a kind of interesting influence onto literature as well, especially in poetry. And it came about actually the Western Europeans introduction, again reintroduction to Greek and Roman classics. Okay, so they are actually revisiting, relearning all the old traditional writings of Greek and Roman period. Okay, and marked a new interest in science and arts. Again, they are looking into science and arts again. And European poetry, of course, influenced by the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch, who were pioneering modern lyric based on a speaker meditating his own feelings. So when you talk about the own feelings, you are talking about you are focusing on your own kind. That means the human being, mankind. Okay. And they also attempted to bring classical meters like the Greek and Roman classical meter into English form. Meters means a kind of way of writing or explaining poetry in a metrical format. Okay, so they also reintroduced those verse forms into English verse and to find English substitutes for them. Okay, and one of the biggest change happened in English poetry tradition is the reintroduction of 14-line sonnets, and most pioneer of them all is of course William Shakespeare. A 14-line sonnet. He's very popular for that, and he has got the tradition from Petrarch of Italian poet. Okay, they are also contemporary, of course, 14th century. And there was a huge learning going on across different countries at that time in Europe. So kind of Renaissance happened. But one of the most interesting elements of Renaissance poetry is that exaggeration and excess and extravagant imagery. These are the key elements in Renaissance poetry. Let's move ahead. Now we move on to new classical period. This period is characterized by a precise and controlled imagination, so imitation of classical forms. So classical form means Greco-Roman, Greek and Roman literary tradition. So with an emphasis on restraint and correctness, order and good taste. But there is a change. Is that the changes happen from Renaissance to this period. But these neoclassical poets or neoclassical literary figures, they emphasize on restraint, correctness, order, good taste, and all other things in their literary expression. It can be that poetry or any other literary genre. Why? Because serving the aims of period known as the Enlightenment. So they are after Renaissance, they are trying to get enlightenment. Of course, Renaissance is heavily influenced by Greco-Roman tradition, of course, and neoclassical. That means the classical, and you're trying to reinvent the classic. Okay, that's why it's called neoclassical in a layman's term. Okay, and with its appreciation of reason and belief in universal truth, as you can see here, the neoclassical poetic style has stressed clarity of meaning. So number one thing, that there's stressed clarity of meaning over extravagance of form and metaphor. Okay, so we just saw that in Renaissance they're also doing a kind of exaggeration, excess and extravagant imagery. But in neoclassical, they refine that we cannot go for extravagant imagery and all other thing in forms and metaphor, but we need to clearly say in linguistic form, in poetry. Okay, so they stress on clarity of meaning, not on metaphor and form. That's a neoclassical tradition. Poetry was typically didactic. You know, didactic means teachable things. That means you want to say and teach or preach something to the reader. So poetry is all about didactic. And then the rise of satire, another form is the satire through poetry, helped further the intellectual's goal of improving human society. Okay, let's move ahead with Romanticism. So Romantic period, as you know it, but it's a kind of a revolt against neoclassical period, neoclassical poetic tradition. So poets rebelled against neoclassical restriction. So as you can see, neoclassical, they're very restricted in their forms and everything. They always look for restraint, correctness, and order and good taste in poetry. But here, Romanticism, they revolt against, they go against this traditional form. And they say that, no, we don't believe all this thing, but they said that we should go against neoclassical restrictions and dominance of reason as a poetic aim. And Romantic poetry celebrated the imagination. Look at here. Their most important trademark of Romanticism is called the imagination over rationality. Of course, we human beings are rational, but they said that our imagination will be number one here, and passion and dreams over reason, external reality, and isolated individuality over collective mankind. So their key trait in Romanticism is that imagination, passion, dreams, and an isolated individuality. So probably you have studied Romantic literature or Romantic poetry. As you can see, Keats, Shelley, and all other great giants in poetic tradition, all these big poets, they're all quite imaginative, dream and isolated individuals. They all celebrated this kind of trademark, and they bring about a huge change in Romantic period. Okay, so Romantic poetry admitted a great sentiment and looked both to celebrate the supernatural and elevate the ordinary. Before, the poetry is talking about all the big names and everything, the elements inside, the themes, the idea is all high society, high class. But here, Romanticism, they bring the very down to earth kind of material or idea into their poetry, and an interpolation of supernatural idea into their poetic forms, and imagery and metaphor and everything. And some new discoveries happen: blank verse, ballads, lyrics, and odes eclipsed satire, and didactic forms in heroic couplet. So satire and didactic poems, they're all gone. They're all less celebrated over, because blank verse, ballads, and lyrics, odes, these are all dominant forms in romantic period poetic tradition. Let's go ahead. Now we move on to Victorian period. This era, or this age of Victorian poetry, is characterized by a tension between, so there is a conflict, a tension between poetry's romantic tradition, the romantic period of fantasy and freedom, and the industrialized world's growing emphasis on money, property, security, religious faith, and patriotism. Now, there is a huge change between romantic period and Victorian period. So Victorian period is kind of, again, it's kind of tension. If it is not direct revolt or fighting against romantic period, it's just a tension. And poets or all literary figures, they are trying to get away from romantic ideals of fantasy and freedom, okay, into growing emphasis on money, property, security, religious faith, and patriotism. So these new ideas are taking ground, okay, in their psychological outlook of how they write poetry and everything. So it's a natural transition, okay, because we see the industrialization is happening just a little bit in that period. And much Victorian poetry is romantic, of course, and escapist, employing traditional forms. However, some Victorian poets tackled contemporary concern with hint of irony. The formal experimentation of a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins anticipated and influenced many modernists. Now we are ushering a kind of modernist literary period. So they started a kind of modernist movement. Okay, so well, they influenced in a way, but they didn't start it actually. But we will see how it was started in a bit. Okay, let's move on to next slide. It's called symbolism. So symbolism, it's all about rebelling against the indigestible realism of Victorian literature. The symbolist poets return to the imaginative freedom of Romanticism. Now, symbolist is a kind of lenient to Romanticism in a sense, but focus less on individual experience and more on enigmatic, mystical, and mythical connections between the visual world and what lies beyond it. Now, this is interesting here. They didn't take romanticism very directly, and they focused less on individual experience. Now, one of the key trademarks of romanticism is, of course, as you know, is that individual experience. Okay, individualism, but they focus less on that point, but they are going beyond that. It's called the mystical, enigmatic. That means you cannot touch it or you cannot grasp it. Those kind of idea, and mythical connections between the visual world and what lies beyond it. So they're just trying something else here, okay, through symbolism. And in your 20th century English poetry, probably we'll try a bit of symbolic poems, just one or two maybe, just to give you a kind of idea of what they're talking about here. Okay, and their poetry often rejects the reigning social values of piety and optimism, and instead celebrating a decadent vision of wild desires, dreams, and decay. So they're very much wild in their ideas and dreams and decay. Quite abnormal for romanticism. But those tradition of symbolic poetry, they got the idea instrumentalism, but that they elaborated those ideas into far more enigmatic, mystical kind of thing, mythical connections they are trying to establish between our visible world to beyond invisible world. Okay, and they give importance to wild desires, dreams, and decay. There are so many reasons for that. We'll discover in 20th century poetry. Now let's go ahead. Now, modernism. This is the thing that you need to know, and we'll be dealing with modernist, a kind of 20th century poetry. This period is characterized by a conscious re-examination of what poetry is. Now they're looking into poetry again. What is this all about? They're reinventing the wheel. There is interesting expression in English: reinvent the wheel. Poetry is always there, but they are asking what poetry is all about now. Okay, so this is the inquiry they are doing within the established form or genre of poetry. Sorry, and the breakdown of traditional form and style. So they are quite revolt against every single tradition. Okay, it's not romanticism or symbolism or any other thing or Renaissance, but they are asking about the forms and styles. And attention was increasingly paid to the density of language. Okay, so they are focused on density of, as minimal as possible. They are trying to convey the meaning, kind of symbolic, but modernist, early modernist, they also use those kind of form, those kind of linguistic form of minimalism, okay, in their poetry writing. And of course, they are far more interested in intensity of imagery, okay, powerful imagery, and as a way of rendering the complexities and the stresses of external reality, the reality we are facing. They try to replicate, re-encompass those kind of idea to only two mediums. One is density of language, minimalistic use of powerful form of language, and imagery as well. Okay. Modernist poetry frequently displays motifs of alienation from society. Now, again, it's quite interesting to see here that they're alienated from society, more or less kind of romantic ideal in a sense, but they are not romantic in a sense, but they are very much real life kind of questionnaire. Okay, they are asking questions about society and everything, so they alienate. There is a tendency of alienation in the poetry of what society is all about. Okay, and then struggles, the struggles with the effects of urbanization. Okay, massive cities and towns are happening all across the world, and the effects of those are also displayed through their modernist poetry. And technological advancement, growing technological and urbanization, and machine revolution, everything. They are just finding away from that kind of society. As modernism rejects poetic tradition, it embraces the unregulated rhythms of free verse. They're the master of free verse, modernist poets. And this is the modernism is all about. Very simplistic way of talking about modernism, but we'll discover in the later lectures what modernism is all about. And it's very difficult to understand actually what they're talking about, and there is no precise definition of modernism, but we will try our best from different aspects of modernism to try to establish, or just to get the idea what modernism is all about. Okay, now that's the end of your lecture, but before I move on, this guide or this lecture is a brief definition of poetry that we try to establish, and at the same time we try to give a kind of quick overview on the periods of English tradition, English poetic tradition, as a literary genre. Now, in later classes, in live classes or video lectures, we'll be talking about more into modernist 20th century poetry, one by one. Okay, hopefully you understand this, and you listen again, and you take notes and try to understand and make your own notes. And if any question, then we'll be answering in our later classes. Thank you very much, guys.